welcome to the Playing Books podcast.
Thank you so much for having me today.
Yeah, of course. Today we have a truly astonishing episode lined up for you.
Astonishing is definitely the right word for it.
Right. We are going to unpack a real-life cloak and dagger operation from 1953 that fundamentally altered global geopolitics.
And, it's a story that so many people just don't know about.
Exactly. The focus of our exploration today is this book, Operation Ajax, the story of the CIA coup that remade the Middle East by Mike de Seve, Daniel Burwen, illustrator, Stephen Kinzer, foreword.
It's just such a phenomenal format for this kind of history.
It really is. And let me tell you, this is not your typical dry history lesson. I mean, this is a story of espionage, secret midnight meetings, manufactured uprisings.
The kind of stuff you'd see in a movie, honestly.
Yeah, but it's real. Decisions made in the shadows that basically created the complex, volatile world you and I navigate right now.
It absolutely is. What we're examining today is a historical narrative adapted into a brilliant graphic novel format.
Which makes it so accessible.
Exactly. Blending heavily researched events, declassified documents, and profound real-world consequences. For you listening, the mission of this episode is to walk you through the architecture of a covert operation that changed the very nature of international relations.
We're getting right into the mechanics of it.
We are. We're going to analyze the psychological profiles of the key players, the specific methodology of overthrowing a sovereign government, and the long-term devastating echoes of those actions.
Echoes that still reverberate today. I think to really grasp the magnitude of what happens in 1953, we have to start where Stephen Kinzer starts in the foreword of this book.
Which is such a brilliant way to open it.
It is. He doesn't begin in the Situation Room or the Oval Office. He begins in 1997 on a personal trip to Iran.
Right.
And he sets up this fascinating contradiction. He reminds us that Iran, historically known as Persia, was history's first true empire. We're talking ancient, monumental history here.
The empire of Cyrus the Great.
Yeah, Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes. This was a civilization that served as a beacon for world culture. I mean, their contributions to mathematics, medicine, poetry, architecture, they were immense.
It was the absolute center of the world at one point.
Exactly.
And it's a necessary contrast to establish right out of the gate. Kinzer looks at the map of the modern Middle East, and as he points out, Iran is this massive country sitting right at the geopolitical crossroads.
Right in the middle of everything.
Right. Given its sheer size, its strategic location, and its incredibly rich heritage, you would logically expect it to be a vibrant, wealthy, highly influential nation today.
You'd expect a thriving superpower.
Exactly. But the reality he observed while traveling through the country in 1997 was completely different. He saw a nation that felt isolated, economically struggling, and just fundamentally disconnected from the global community.
A massive gap between the grandeur of what it was and what it has become.
And that gap is the central mystery that drives his entire investigation.
So he is driving across these stunning ancient landscapes, going from Tehran to Qum, down to Isfahan, just ruminating on this stark contradiction. And then he has this incredible defining interaction.
The bazaar vendor?
Yes. He's walking through a bustling bazaar talking to a local vendor. The vendor realizes he's American, and instead of hostility, he offers this incredibly melancholic observation.
It's so striking.
The vendor says, "But then you came and took it away from us."
Just a heavy thing to hear.
Kinzer is taken aback. He's a journalist, an American, and that specific phrasing doesn't really fit the typical self-image most Americans hold of their country's historical role.
Right, the idea of America as a purely democratizing force.
Exactly. But it wasn't just an isolated comment. Other people he meets on this trip start giving him similar answers. They keep bringing up the year 1953.
And they keep mentioning one name.
Mossadegh?
Which brings us to a crucial phenomenon that Kinzer explicitly references: historical amnesia.
Oh, that's such a key concept here.
It really is. When he returns to the United States after that trip, his immediate instinct as a journalist is to find a book about what happened in Iran in 1953. He assumes there must be volumes written about it in the West.
Because the Iranians remember it so vividly.
Exactly. But to his great surprise, he finds almost nothing in the mainstream historical discourse. And this is a vital concept for you to consider as a listener.
How does an entire society just forget an event that shaped modern geopolitics?
The answer lies in the nature of covert action. When a nation operates entirely in the shadows, the consequences are often a visceral daily reality only for the people on the receiving end.
Right, the people actually living through the fallout.
Meanwhile, the citizens of the nation orchestrating the action, the taxpayers funding it, remain entirely in the dark, happily ignorant of the fires being set in their name.
It's a sobering realization. Kinzer basically concludes, well, if I want to read the comprehensive history of this event, I'm going to have to write it myself.
And he did.
Which he did. And that extensive research forms the historical bedrock of the graphic novel we are exploring today. But to really understand why 1953 was such an explosive flashpoint, we have to establish the global stakes.
The Cold War context is everything.
We are in the early freezing heights of the Cold War. The world is fractured. The threat of nuclear annihilation is a new, terrifying reality. American policymakers are profoundly fearful of Soviet expansion.
But what strikes me as the most critical context here is the nature of the CIA itself at that time.
Yeah, it wasn't what we think of today.
Not at all. At this point in history, the CIA was originally designed merely for intelligence gathering. It was an analytical body.
Collecting information, decrypting messages.
Exactly, advising the president. It was not acting as a shadow military.
And that is why the shift detailed in this narrative is so monumental. Operation Ajax, the code name for this secret intervention, marked the very first time the CIA deliberately set out to destroy a foreign government.
It wasn't just aggressive tradecraft.
No, it was the fundamental repurposing of an American institution. Deciding to use an intelligence agency to actively overthrow a fragile new democracy was a watershed policy decision.
It forever changed how the United States operated across the globe.
It proved that a government could be dismantled not with invading armies, but with briefcases of cash, fabricated newspaper articles, and hired thugs.
A dangerous new template.
That would be replicated for decades.
Oh.
But wait, before we get into the mechanics of how they actually pulled that off, because the tactics are genuinely shocking, we need to understand the people involved.
The cast of characters.
Right, because history isn't just a clash of faceless nations. It's a geopolitical chessboard played by human beings with very specific egos, blind spots, and motivations.
It is, and to understand the complexity of this conflict, we need to look objectively at the competing interests. The clash wasn't simply good versus evil.
No, it was a collision of deeply held national imperatives.
Exactly, and I should note for you listening, we are impartially reporting the historical claims and quotes exactly as presented in the book. We aren't taking sides on the political actions of the U.S., the UK, Iran, or any other entities involved.
Just laying out the facts as they're documented?
We have to analyze the viewpoints of all the actors exactly as the authors have laid them out in the text.
So let's start with the man at the center of the storm, Mohammad Mossadegh, the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran. And he is a uniquely compelling figure.
Very unique.
He isn't some military strongman. He's an elderly, highly educated aristocrat. The book details how he frequently conducts state business from his bed in pajamas.
He was prone to weeping during speeches, too.
Yeah, weeping, famously prone to fainting spells. Yet, despite all these quirks, he has this immense, undeniable appeal to the Iranian people.
His calls to overthrow foreign influence resonated deeply.
Deeply. And his primary unyielding goal is to nationalize Iranian oil. Because for half a century, the British have effectively controlled the extraction and sale of Iran's oil.
And Mossadegh believes that wealth belongs to the Iranian people.
Right. He also relies heavily on his right-hand man, Hossein Fatemi, a fiery journalist and politician who is fiercely loyal to this vision of total national independence.
Now let's examine the opposing force, the British government and the AIRC, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company.
Their perspective is crucial to understand why they reacted so aggressively.
Exactly. In 1953, Britain is still recovering from the utter devastation of World War II. Their economy is in tatters, they are heavily indebted, and the Abadan oil refinery in Iran is the crown jewel of their overseas assets.
It's practically keeping the British Empire financially afloat.
So the British view Mossadegh's actions not as a noble quest for sovereignty, but as an illegal existential threat.
There's a specific quote in the text about this.
Yes. The British characterize Mossadegh's nationalization as insensate. They argue that by seizing the oil fields, he is causing a great, highly functional enterprise to grind to a halt.
They felt they were the only ones who could manage it properly.
In their view, unless Mossadegh is checked, the entire free world will be much poorer, including, in their rather paternalistic words, the deluded Iranian people themselves.
The rhetoric on both sides is just scorching. You have the British claiming Mossadegh is a madman destroying global stability, while Mossadegh is publicly painting the AIOC as a gang of unscrupulous bloodsuckers.
That's a strong phrase.
He meant it. He pointed out that the AIOC frequently paid more in taxes to the British government than they paid in royalties to Iran.
So you have this massive, immovable ideological conflict over the most valuable natural resource on the planet.
And caught right in the crossfire of this is the Iranian royal family, specifically Mohammad Reza Pahlavi the Shah.
A fascinating, tragic figure.
He is characterized as a playboy, the son of the former autocratic ruler Reza Khan. He likes fast cars, European tailoring, but he completely lacks his father's iron will.
He also has a twin sister, Ashraf Pahlavi.
Right. She's described as fiercely ambitious and often highly critical of her brother's perceived weakness.
Because the Shah's position is incredibly precarious. He is the reigning monarch, the symbol of historical continuity, but his actual political power is slipping rapidly.
As Mossadegh captures the hearts and minds of the populace.
The Shah is fundamentally indecisive, caught between his desire to be an absolute ruler and his paralyzing fear of being overthrown.
But a coup requires more than just manipulating politicians and monarchs.
You need physical leverage on the streets.
Which introduces the muscle and the clerics. You can't just decree a revolution from an embassy desk. You need bodies in the street.
Enter Ayatollah Kashani,
a powerful clerical leader with a vast, devoted following. He initially supported Mossadegh but becomes alienated. He sees Mossadegh's secular nationalism as a threat to religious authority.
You also have Colonel Nasiri.
Yes, a high-ranking officer in the Imperial Guard, fiercely loyal to the Shah, representing the military faction.
And then you have the street-level operators.
Shaban, nicknamed the Brainless.
Basically a local strongman. He runs a traditional Iranian gymnasium and acts as a thug for hire, capable of mobilizing violent mobs at a moment's notice.
It is an incredibly volatile ecosystem, competing ambitions everywhere. And into this tinderbox steps the operative who will light the match.
Kermit Roosevelt.
The grandson of Theodore Roosevelt. Kermit is the CIA's point man for the Middle East.
He had spent years operating undercover in the region.
Studying the culture, even writing about Middle East oil before joining the agency, he is portrayed as possessing this supreme, almost aristocratic confidence.
Practically giddy about the opportunity to run this operation.
He is the architect tasked with taking this chaotic cast of characters, the weak Shah, the angry clerics, the greedy street thugs, and orchestrating them into a symphony of regime change.
Which brings us to the actual mechanics of the operation.
If you're Kermit Roosevelt and you've just landed in Tehran with a briefcase full of cash and a mandate to overthrow a wildly popular prime minister, where do you even start?
How do you manufacture a rebellion out of thin air?
What's brilliant and terrifying about this history is that we don't have to guess. Because of declassified documents, we can see the exact, literal blueprint of Operation Ajax.
A multi-step plan, a masterclass in psychological and political warfare.
The tactical approach is deeply cynical,
but highly effective. The intelligence agencies recognize they cannot simply assassinate Mossadegh or launch a sentinel military assault. He is too popular.
It would trigger a massive nationalist backlash,
possibly pushing Iran straight into the arms of the Soviet Union. Therefore, the first objective is to fracture his base of support.
Step 1 and 2, the propaganda. The initial directive is stark. Create anti-Mossadegh situation by the mullahs.
They understand that in a deeply religious society, the clergy holds immense sway. If they can convince the religious leaders that Mossadegh is a threat to Islam, they can turn the streets against him.
And this is where the psychological warfare really kicks into high gear. They don't just hand out bribes, they engage in massive media manipulation.
Fabricating news articles.
Yes, planting them in local papers. The most devious example from the book is something they call the Black Doc.
A forged document designed to be distributed anonymously.
Its entire purpose was to expose a completely fake, secret alliance between Mossadegh and the Iranian Communist Party.
The document would claim that Mossadegh was plotting with the communists to overthrow the religious establishment and execute the mullahs.
It's important to pause and analyze the mechanics of this disinformation. Why would the Iranian public believe this sudden smear against a nationalist hero?
The genius of the Black Doc lies in how it exploited existing underlying anxieties. The Cold War fear of atheistic communism was palpable.
Even in Iran.
By forging this document, the CIA wasn't trying to change Mossadegh's political platform. They were changing his fundamental identity in the eyes of the religious class.
Framing him as an existential spiritual threat.
Textbook divide and conquer. inject fabricated narratives, let confirmation bias take over, and watch the coalition tear itself apart.
They are weaponizing paranoia. And once they have the public agitated, they have to deal with the legalities of the coup. They need cover.
Managing the monarch.
Right. Step 3. The psychological profile the CIA builds on the Shah is brutal. The planning documents quote his personality flaws directly.
To play his role, the Shah requires special preparation.
Yes. By nature, a creature of indecision, beset by formless doubts and fears, he must be induced to play his role.
They know he is weak-willed.
They know he doesn't want to take responsibility, so they have to essentially back him into a psychological corner until he acts as the legal rubber stamp.
Because the legal cover is paramount. The CIA understood the cultural architecture of Iran. A significant portion of the military still deeply respected the monarchy.
The Shah possessed the constitutional authority to issue a firman, a royal decree.
And when we say firman, we aren't just talking about a piece of paper. This carries centuries of absolute monarchical weight.
If the Shah signs a firman dismissing Mossadegh and appointing a new prime minister, the coup is suddenly closed in constitutional legitimacy.
Without that signature, Kermit is just orchestrating an illegal military mutiny.
With it, Mossadegh becomes the illegal usurper the moment he refuses to step down. Securing the Shah's signature was the critical linchpin.
Which sets up the physical usurpation. Steps 4 and 5. First, they buy off the key radio stations. Controlling the broadcast is controlling reality.
Second, get the Shah to sign the firman. Third, install their hand-picked replacement, General Zahedi, as prime minister,
announcing his appointment over the newly acquired airwaves.
And then comes the physical climax. Steps 6 and 7. The CIA planned to orchestrate a hired mob to spiral out of control,
directing the violence specifically toward Mossadegh's residence.
Once the chaos reached a fever pitch, their paid allies within the Iranian military would roll in with tanks to restore order.
The ultimate false flag tactic. Secretly manufacture the violent crisis, then publicly offer the military solution, seizing control under the guise of stabilizing the nation.
To really grasp how granular this sabotage was, we have to look at this amazing piece of evidence highlighted in the text, the secret Appendix A.
A declassified document from June 1st, 1953.
It outlines the interim financing of the opposition. It literally states, CIA will supply $35,000 to Zahedi,
bankrolling the man they intend to install as dictator.
But that's not even the most shocking part of the appendix.
No, the secret Appendix A reveals a secondary, devastating prong of their attack: economic warfare.
We discussed the propaganda, but words only go so far.
You have to make the population feel material pain. The document details a plan to intentionally frame Mossadegh for leading the country into complete economic collapse.
The CIA suggested utilizing their technical capabilities to print masses of excellent imitation paper currency, counterfeit Iranian reals.
I really want to unpack this because the implications are staggering.
They are talking about intentionally counterfeiting a sovereign nation's currency to ruin their economy. How does that actually force a regime change?
It is a brutal macroeconomic weapon. When you flood a market with high-quality counterfeit bills, you artificially inflate the money supply overnight.
The currency devalues instantly.
Hyperinflation kicks in. Suddenly, the price of basic staples bread, fuel, rent triples in a matter of weeks. The savings of the middle class are wiped out.
The merchant class, the bazaris, see their businesses collapse.
And who does the public blame? They don't blame an invisible intelligence agency. They blame the man sitting in the prime minister's office.
By destroying the livelihoods of everyday citizens, they created the desperate conditions necessary for upheaval.
Regime change, in this context, is a comprehensive assault on a nation's infrastructure, its economy, and its fundamental social trust.
It's a complete dismantling of a society from the inside out. So that is the meticulous blueprint.
But as the military adage goes, no plan survives first contact with the enemy.
The actual execution of Operation Ajax is where this history reads like an unbearably tense thriller. It begins with a necessary, secret midnight meeting.
Kermit Roosevelt has to physically meet with the Shah to convince him to sign the firman.
The description in the graphic novel is incredibly vivid. Kermit is driven onto the palace grounds in the dead of night, hiding under a blanket on the floorboards of a car.
To avoid detection by Mossadegh's loyalist guards,
they rely on an asset inside the palace, a man they codenamed Rosencrantz, to facilitate the entry.
And when Kermit finally emerges from under the blanket in the dimly lit palace, the atmosphere is suffocated by intense paranoia.
The Shah is absolutely terrified.
He is acutely aware he is meeting an American intelligence agent, but his mind is racing. He basically asks, How do I even know you represent the U.S. government? Maybe you're a provocation from the mullahs.
Maybe you're working for Mossadegh to test my loyalty. He's paralyzed by the fear of being set up.
He demands absolute, undeniable proof that Winston Churchill and Dwight Eisenhower are personally backing this play.
And Kermit's solution to this paranoid demand is one of the most brilliant pieces of spycraft I've ever heard.
It really is.
He doesn't show him a badge or a signed letter. He tells the Shah to listen to the BBC radio broadcast the next evening. The BBC's standard Persian language broadcast always ended with the announcer saying, "It is now exactly midnight."
Kermit promises the Shah that he will have London alter the broadcast.
The announcer will instead say, "It is now exactly 1 minute to midnight."
And the next night, the Shah tunes in. The BBC announcer delivers the altered phrase.
That single tiny linguistic shift completely reassures the Shah that Winston Churchill is entirely in on the plot.
It speaks volumes about how interconnected the state intelligence apparatus and state broadcasting services were.
It was the ultimate verification. With the Shah finally reassured, he signs the royal decrees dismissing Mossadegh and appointing Zahedi. The trap is set.
But on the night of August 15th into August 16th, 1953, the initial execution of the coup fails catastrophically.
The coordination breaks down. Colonel Nasiri is dispatched to Mossadegh's residence in the middle of the night to deliver the decree, but Mossadegh's loyalist military commanders have been tipped off.
The element of surprise is entirely lost. Nasiri is surrounded, disarmed, and immediately arrested.
It is a spectacular disaster for the CIA. Mossadegh wakes up, realizes what has happened, and immediately goes on the national radio.
He announces to the country that a coup was attempted by the Shah and foreign elements, but it was snuffed out.
The news hits the global press wires instantly. The Shah wakes up to the news that his coup has failed and his lead military officer is in a dungeon.
He panics completely. Terrified that Mossadegh will have him executed for high treason, the Shah flees the country,
flying his private plane first to Baghdad and then on to Rome.
The reaction in Washington and London is sheer panic. The operation is blown, the cover is destroyed.
A frantic, encrypted wire arrives at the CIA station in Tehran, ordering Kermit Roosevelt and his team to pack up, burn their documents, and evacuate immediately.
The telegram warns that the result of this failure will spell disaster for the free world.
And you could understand their terror. The pre-coup destabilization efforts had fractured the country so wildly that Iran was now in unprecedented vulnerability.
With the monarch having fled, a massive power vacuum opened up. The conventional wisdom in Washington was that a communist takeover was imminent.
The rational move was to retreat before American agents were paraded before the world. But this is the exact moment where the history hinges on a single man's audacity.
Kermit Roosevelt receives the direct order to abort, and he flat out refuses.
He ignores the order. He looks at the chaotic chessboard, and he realizes something profound about human psychology. Because Mossadegh believes the Shah was the primary architect of the coup, and because the Shah has cowardly fled the country.
Mossadegh firmly believes the threat is entirely neutralized.
It is a brilliant, terrifying tactical pivot. Kermit understands that Mossadegh's guard is now completely down.
He thinks he has won. More importantly, he still has absolutely no idea that the CIA is orchestrating the chaos. The American hand remains hidden.
Kermit deduces that the spectacular failure of the first attempt provided the perfect smokescreen to launch a second, far more chaotic attempt.
So he goes rogue. Instead of packing his bags, Kermit doubles down. He orchestrates a massive, terrifying false flag operation.
He decides to trigger the fake communist uprising they had theorized in the blueprint. But he executes it on a scale that overwhelms the city.
The visual depiction of these scenes in the narrative is incredibly intense.
You have CIA operatives utilizing vast slush funds to hire thousands of street thugs, gangsters, and impoverished citizens.
They pay them to dress in everyday clothes, pose as radical communist 2D party members, and tear the city apart.
These hired mobs run through the streets of Tehran, tearing down statues of the Shah, smashing shop windows, attacking religious symbols, literally setting the city on fire.
The sheer ruthlessness of the tactic is chilling. There is a moment in the historical recount where an operative questions the morality of creating such indiscriminate violence among civilians.
The justification given highlights the absolute primacy of terror in this strategy. The logic is essentially, by the time there's evidence, they'll have rolled in a convoy, strung you up, and shot you. Then where will your democracy be?
The goal wasn't to win a political debate. The goal was to create a sensory overload of chaos.
When a city is burning, critical thinking vanishes. Investigation becomes impossible. Fear becomes the only governing dynamic, and people will accept any authoritarian solution that promises order.
And what makes it so tragic is that it was a grand theatrical production where the actors didn't even know they were in a play.
The riots and gun battles confused almost everyone involved. The thugs screaming communist slogans had no idea they were paid by American capitalists.
The Iranian soldiers who mutinied against Mossadegh to crush the communists had no idea they were fighting to preserve Western control over their own oil.
Almost every single person bleeding and dying on the streets of Tehran was unwittingly playing a part written by a foreign intelligence officer hiding in a basement.
And the manipulation of reality extended globally. The historical record notes that even highly respected international outlets, like the New York Times, unwittingly parroted doctored press releases.
They reported to the world that the Iranian people were rising up organically to depose a hated government.
The illusion was flawless. The climax of this orchestrated descent into madness was the physical assault on Mossadegh's house.
It was defended by a small contingent of loyalist guards, but they were eventually overwhelmed by the sheer volume of the CIA-funded mob, backed by rogue military tanks.
The house was shelled, breached, and completely looted. It stands as a visceral, fiery symbol of the destruction of Iran's fragile democratic experiment.
It's a devastating sequence. Mossadegh manages to escape over a back wall during the assault, but he surrenders a few days later, realizing the country is lost.
Which leads us directly into the endgame and the immediate, brutal aftermath of Operation Ajax.
With the democratically elected government overthrown, the Shah returns from his brief exile in Rome. He flies back into Tehran.
The narrative describes him stepping off the plane, projecting the aura of a conqueror, greeted by saluting military officers who had just handed his country back to him.
The CIA's hand-picked man, General Zahedi, is officially installed as the new prime minister. The Shah reclaims the peacock throne.
But the experience of being overthrown profoundly altered his psychology. He returned not as a constitutional monarch, but with a mandate for absolute dictatorship.
As the historical texts note, the Shah realized he could never again rely on the organic affection of his people to keep him in power. He had to rely on fear.
For Washington, he was celebrated as their best friend in the Middle East, a reliable bulwark against Soviet influence.
But for the Iranian people, his return marked the beginning of life under a highly repressive, heavily militarized, and corrupt state.
To ensure he would never face another uprising, the Shah established a massive, deeply feared secret police force known as SAVAK.
And it is a dark irony of history that SAVAK was initially trained and organized with the direct assistance of the CIA and Israeli intelligence.
And who was placed at the very top of this terrifying apparatus? General Nasseri, the loyal officer arrested during the failed first attempt.
He was promoted and given virtually unchecked power to crush any opposition. The fates of the other individuals caught up in this storm are equally striking and incredibly grim.
Take Hossein Fatemi, Mossadegh's brilliant right-hand man.
He went into hiding after the coup, but he was hunted down. The historical accounts detail that while he was being transported in a police van, the vehicle was intercepted by a mob of the Shah's loyalists.
Fatemi was pulled out and stabbed repeatedly. He survived the stabbing, only to be subjected to a swift military tribunal.
Convicted of treason and executed by a firing squad. A bleak end for a man whose crime was fighting for his country's autonomy.
Conversely, you look at the figures who embrace the corruption, and you see immense profit. Shaban the Brainless was lavishly rewarded by the grateful Shah.
Rewarded with a yellow Cadillac.
He transformed into a flashy, untouchable public figure in Tehran, operating with total impunity.
And fascinatingly, the historical epilogue notes that decades later, after the 1979 Islamic Revolution, Shaban managed to escape and lived out the rest of his days in Los Angeles.
It's surreal. And as for the foreign powers who orchestrated the whole thing, Winston Churchill technically achieved his imperialist goal of the coup.
He wanted the nationalist Mossadegh removed, and he got it. But he did not secure his ultimate prize, the total restoration of the British monopoly on oil.
Because Washington, fully aware they had provided the funds and strategy, insisted on a massive share. Britain had to share the spoils.
And then we consider Kermit Roosevelt.
Huh.
He emerged as a legend within the intelligence community. He viewed Ajax as his greatest achievement.
He engineered arms deals for the Shah later on, and the blueprint he designed was considered such a flawless success that it became standard operating procedure.
The historical record shows that shortly after Iran, the agency asked him to use the exact same playbook to coordinate a regime change in Guatemala.
To overthrow President Jacobo Arbenz, Operation Ajax proved that covert regime change was a cheap alternative to war, setting a template used repeatedly throughout the Cold War.
Which brings us to the final and undoubtedly the most important segment of this entire podcast episode, the echoes of 1953, how Ajax remade the world.
Because the fundamental thesis of Stephen Kinzer's research is that the story emphatically does not end when the Shah reclaims his throne in 1953.
The consequences stretch out like shockwaves over decades.
To understand the modern Middle East, you have to connect 1953 directly to 1979. The historical analysis lays out a profound thesis. Operation Ajax violently uprooted Iran from its organic democratic foundations.
By crushing the secular democratic movement, the U.S. and the U.K. inadvertently eliminated the moderate center of Iranian politics.
The Shah's increasingly repressive rule over the next 25 years acted like a pressure cooker. He silenced secular liberals and journalists. The only place opposition could safely organize was within the mosques.
That quarter-century of repression directly catalyzed the 1979 Islamic Revolution, bringing Ayatollah Khomeini to power.
And this is where the afterword of the book completely recontextualized history, the hostage crisis context.
When we in the West learn about the militants storming the U.S. Embassy in Tehran in 1979, it is almost exclusively portrayed as this act of random, inexplicable hostility.
But Kinzer explains that years later, the hostage-takers wrote memoirs explaining their minds. And it was all about 1953.
It is a stunning revelation. Consider the timeline from the Iranian perspective. In 1953, the Iranian people forced the Shah to flee. But CIA officers in the American embassy staged Ajax and brought him back.
Fast forward exactly 26 years, the Iranian people have again forced the Shah to flee. And what happens next?
The U.S. government announces it is taking in the exiled Shah for medical treatment. For the Iranians who lived through 1953, this was not a humanitarian gesture. It was a terrifying repeat of history.
They overran the embassy not out of blind hatred, but as a preventative military measure. They were absolutely convinced the CIA was about to use the embassy to stage a second Operation Ajax.
And the most tragic part is that the West didn't understand this motivation at all, because of that historical amnesia we talked about.
The public and politicians had no idea Operation Ajax happened. The secret actions of the 1950s completely blinded the public to the realities of the 1970s.
And the global butterfly effect generated by that 1979 revolution is staggering. The sudden emergence of a radical Islamic republic panicked the United States.
They decided to seek out a counterbalance. They formed a strategic partnership with the leader of neighboring Iraq, Saddam Hussein.
That partnership, born entirely out of the fallout of 1979, ultimately led to immense grief, multiple Gulf Wars.
Simultaneously, the 1979 revolution terrified the Soviet Union. Fear of Islamic radicalism spreading was a primary driver in their disastrous decision to invade Afghanistan later that year.
The rise of Saddam Hussein, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, Kinzer persuasively argues that all of these catastrophes have roots reaching straight back to the basement of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran.
But the ultimate lesson of the book is what it did to the psychology of the Middle East.
By crushing Mossadegh, the West taught an entire generation of rising Middle Eastern leaders a very dark lesson. They learned that championing secular democracy and nationalism would only bring foreign destruction.
It poisoned the well for democratic movements, teaching them that power only comes from the barrel of a gun or religious extremism.
Statesmen in Washington clinked glasses and considered Ajax a bloodless success. But history has delivered a completely different, devastating verdict.
It is universally recognized now as a catastrophic episode that sent the Middle East careening into cycles of authoritarianism.
Which is exactly why we spent this episode unpacking it. So as we wrap up this conversation, I want to issue a challenge to you, our listener.
Let the practical lessons and ideas of this book enhance your lives.
Yes, apply rigorous critical thinking to the news you consume today. Question the simple narratives you hear about geopolitics. Remember the blueprint of Operation Ajax. Recognize that short-term, highly secretive decisions have massive, uncontrollable, long-term consequences.
Seeking out the root causes and deeply considering the perspectives of those who live through the consequences is essential for critical thinking.
Absolutely. And if you want to understand this incredible story in all its intricate visual detail, we explicitly ask you to purchase this book.
It's phenomenal.
Go out and buy Operation Ajax, the story of the CIA coup that remade the Middle East by Mike de Seve, Daniel Burwen, illustrator, Stephen Kinzer, foreword.
It makes complex history completely accessible.
And once you've read it, engage with the creators. Reach out to Mike de Seve and Daniel Burwen on social media. Let them know your thoughts on the graphic novel's visual storytelling.
The artwork truly adds a necessary, visceral layer to the dry documents. It makes the grim reality of the coup palpable.
We also want to involve you in active participation. Leave a comment, send us a message, or drop a review telling us which part of this covert plan shocked you the most.
Was it the macroeconomic sabotage of counterfeiting the currency? The fake communist uprising? The BBC password? We want to hear from you.
To close out today, we want to leave you with Stephen Kinzer's haunting hypothetical from the afterword.
If the West had decided to live with Mossadegh rather than deposing him in 1953, we might have had a thriving democracy in the heart of the Muslim Middle East for the last 3 generations.
How would that have changed the world you live in today?
It's a question that completely rewrites the modern world in your mind.
Thank you so much for spending this time listening to the episode. We appreciate your curiosity. Please follow, subscribe, and share the Plain Book Podcast. We'll see you next time.